Good evening. Idaho voters will troop to the polls tomorrow for an election in which, if the conventional wisdom holds true, there will be a low voter turnout and much confusion over legislative districts and candidates. The major reason for this confusion is reapportionment, the process by which the state legislature decides how Idaho ought to be divided into legislative districts. That question has dominated the nuts and bolts of Idaho politics now for fully 3 years. And it's anybody's guess how it will affect the way things will go tomorrow and, for that matter, in November's general election. Tonight, we will look at how reapportionment has already changed Idaho politics and how it might change politics in this state in the future. Here's Gene McNeil.
This is the community of South Post Falls, not far from Coeur d'Alene in Kootenai County. Voters here are used to electing lawmakers from their own county or occasionally from neighboring Benewah County. But 2 years ago, when legislative boundaries were redrawn, South Post Falls found itself in District 5, a narrow strip along the Washington border from just south of Coeur d'Alene to just north of Lewiston, more than 100 miles away. Most of the people in District 5 live in Latah County, and so do its 3 lawmakers, Democrat Norma Dobler and Republican Doc Lucas from Moscow, Republican Tom Boyd from nearby Genesee. Members of the Idaho legislature, who reapportion themselves every 10 years, say districts like that are unavoidable, since the U.S. Constitution requires that each lawmaker represent about the same number of people. But Bill Heller, one of several North Idaho residents who took the issue to court and won, says that's just an excuse.
The argument that one could not eliminate them, or that they were necessary, or that districts like that were necessary to meet the mandates of one man, one vote was a very early argument that the legislature put forward, was simply, in my mind, a smokescreen which was hiding the true issue that districts like that were created to gerrymander the state of Idaho in favor of incumbents.
Heller got the court to enforce a little-known provision of the Idaho Constitution that prohibits splitting counties into different districts. He says that practice and the gerrymandering it permits undermine representative democracy.
That the effects are that we tend to reduce voter turnout, we tend to create more uncontested races, because when districts are weighted greatly in the favor of one political party over the other, it's likely that the opposition candidate is just not going to run. I mean, why waste your time if you know that the election is virtually rigged or wired?
The statistics Heller uses are persuasive. For the past 20 years, as more counties have been split and districts have taken on stranger and stranger shapes, voter turnout has indeed dropped, and the number of uncontested races has grown dramatically, from just over 10% prior to the first reapportionment in 1966 to fully a third in 1982. And while voting patterns have not changed, Republicans' share of legislative seats has risen steadily since 1962. In that year, GOP candidates got just over 51% of the vote statewide and won about 53% of the seats. 20 years later, that same 51% vote gave Republicans almost 70% of the seats. It was that kind of evidence, plus the clear constitutional prohibition against splitting counties, that persuaded the court to toss the legislature's map out and draw its own. In a strongly worded order, Judge Dar Cogswell wrote, "When a plan is conceived with the objective of preserving the office of elected senators or representatives, only disaster can result." Well, not surprisingly, many incumbent lawmakers think Cogswell's plan, known as 14B, is itself a disaster, and they spent much of last session trying unsuccessfully to kill it.
Well, I think, all in all, when we look at the cost of 14B, the inconvenience and the confusion of the voters in Idaho, most anything would be better than 14B.
The infamous 14B, shown here on the right, is certainly a dramatic departure. To start with, it follows county lines, while the old map zigzagged sometimes wildly across them. Moreover, the county groupings are pretty logical, while some of the old combinations were anything but. Those improvements, however, didn't come without a price. In order to group counties logically and still keep districts about the same size, Cogswell had to superimpose 7 huge districts called flotarials on top of the smaller ones, adding 21 members to the legislature. The current crop of lawmakers, and probably many of the state's voters as well, don't think much of the 21 new bodies. But the lawmakers have more immediate concerns too, like getting reelected. Incumbents have a natural aversion to reapportionment, and the more it changes things, the less they like it. Very few of them like 14B. For most, it will mean at a minimum some new voters to woo. For some, the less lucky, it will mean having to run in districts that bear little resemblance to their old stomping grounds. And for a few, the least lucky, it will mean head-to-head battles with fellow members of the Legislative Club. One of those battles will be joined tomorrow night between two House members who have little in common outside of the fact that they are both Republican. First-termer Jerry Deckard from Eagle is a rising star among Republican moderates, a man whose name has already been mentioned as a possible Speaker of the House. Deckard will take on six-term lawmaker Gene Winchester of Kuna, a longtime stalwart of the conservative faction. Mercifully, head-to-head battles like that will be rare, since Judge Cogswell was kind enough to provide 21 new seats. But Walt Yarborough has another kind of reapportionment problem. For years, the Owyhee County Republican has drawn much of his strength from rural Ada County. This year, he has to run in Elmore County, where his years of building name recognition won't help him very much. And then there's Gordon Hollifield. The Jerome Republican is used to running in Camas, Gooding, and Lincoln counties. This year, he faces a primary challenge in an almost entirely new district, one in which his hometown is badly outnumbered by the population centers of Burley and Rupert. But what if you're not an incumbent, or a candidate, or even a potential candidate? What if you're just a voter? What this new map means to you depends a lot on where you stand in what's often called the power struggle between the cowboys and the city slickers. In the long run, if you live in a city, you will probably gain. If you live in a rural area, you will probably lose. In some places, that shift may take years to show up, but in others, it will be immediate, and in some cases, dramatic. The city of Boise currently has 14 legislators, or about 13% of the seats. After the election, there will be at least 20 and perhaps 21 Boiseans at the State House, giving the capital city substantially more power in the new and larger legislature. In Kootenai County, only one lawmaker currently has an address in the city of Coeur d'Alene, but there could be as many as 7 after the election. The actual number will no doubt be lower than that, but it will still mean a shot in the arm for this underrepresented city's legislative clout. The Nampa-Caldwell area stands a good chance of winning as well, and if all the urban candidates there are victorious, the two cities could almost double their representation. But if the experts agree that urbanization will occur, they disagree about what it will mean.
You know, Idaho just isn't an urban state. Even those people who are elected from urban districts frequently have small farms or small acreages and are representing some people in the rural area anyway. So I really doubt that that's going to have any effect. I look at the people who are now from urban areas, and they just don't fall into the traditional category of what one thinks of as a city slicker.
I think if you look at the people who filed, that's not the case. I think on both tickets, not just here in Ada County, but the kind of people who filed tend to be, or at least the new ones who are entering for the first time, tend to be people who are interested in local government issues. They're interested in preserving the infrastructure in the cities and in having quality public education and having a strong university system, the kind of things that people that live in the cities tend to be more concerned about than people in the outlying areas.
But if the legislature will have more members with urban addresses next year, will it also have more who put D's after their names? Well, on that one, too, everyone has an opinion.
From an overall statewide standpoint, on reviewing the candidates, the elections that are coming down the pike, 14B is going to be very good for the Republican Party. It's going to increase the percentage of Republicans in the legislature.
Well, overall, I don't think we'll see any dramatic changes, particularly in the state Senate this year. I think the Democrats will pick up quite a few House seats, more than we presently have.
The state of Idaho, as you know, is basically Republican, and there are some pockets of Democrats. For instance, in North Idaho, in the Pocatello area, the North End in Boise, those are areas that are where you have concentrations of Democrats. And really what you've done when you've added more districts is you've diluted those particular areas.
Well, I don't really agree with that. If you look at the voting results over the past several years, the Democrats pick up over 45%, usually averaging 47–48% of the vote. I'd hardly call that a pocket. It's more like a pouch, I guess.
Both sides have persuasive arguments. On the one hand, if gerrymandering has helped Republicans, then doing away with it by following county lines should help Democrats. And since Democratic strength tends to be concentrated in the cities, any increase in urban voting power would seem to help them. But Democrats have their problems with the new plan, too. For one thing, they've had to recruit more candidates and raise more money this year, and both chores tend to be more difficult for them than for Republicans. Then there's the question of voter confusion. In Canyon County, for example, voters are used to choosing one senator and 2 representatives. This year, they'll have to fill 4 full slates, 12 seats. That's the kind of situation that can lead to low voter turnout and to an increase in straight party line voting, neither of which would be good news for the minority party. Democrats have a special problem in Canyon County, too. That predominantly Republican electorate has occasionally gone for Democrats, but only from fairly urban districts within the county. Under 14B, all candidates will have to run county-wide. That could spell trouble for first-term Democrat Terry Riley, elected in 1982 from the Nampa area. Riley is generally considered to be a very strong candidate, but some party stalwarts fear that even he won't be able to overcome the Republican advantage in Canyon County. Riley is particularly critical because the Senate is particularly critical. If Democrats don't get 15 seats come November, the governor's veto power will be meaningless, and in the words of one observer, they might as well all pack up and go home.
Well, I think there's a reasonable possibility of that. I think with a little bit of luck, that's a very real possibility.
The chances of that are no greater under 14B than under any of the plans that we've operated under in the past. It's always a potential possibility, and they've come close a time or two to gaining 2/3 control of the Senate, but I don't think that's in the cards this year.
So what's the final verdict on 14B? Well, you'd have to call it a hung jury. On the one hand, there are all those new bodies, the higher costs, the huge districts, and the voter confusion that's expected to bring a low turnout tomorrow. On the other hand, the court found strong evidence of gerrymandering, and that, for whatever reason it's done, is never good for the voters. Then, too, some of Judge Cogswell's concoctions make a lot more sense than the districts they replace. As to which party wins and which loses, well, you've heard the pros make their cases. The thing to remember is that with the power of the governor's veto stamp hanging in the balance, there's a lot at stake this election year.
Politicians and political party activists have been just short of consumed by this reapportionment issue. They sleep, eat, and drink the intricacies of where the district lines are drawn and which precincts tend to vote more Democratic than Republican. And reporters who have been covering these discussions have been consumed by it in a way, too. They find it very interesting. And 3 of them are with us now to talk a bit more about how reapportionment is likely to affect Idaho politics. Jean McNeil, you've already seen. She is the executive producer of this broadcast and our resident reapportionment expert. Randy Staples is with us tonight in Pocatello. He edits the editorial page of the Idaho State Journal newspaper and has written critically of the 14B plan. And Jim Fisher joins this discussion in Moscow tonight. Jim covers politics for the Lewiston Morning Tribune newspaper in Lewiston. Jim, let me start with you. On the question of all this confusion about the election tomorrow and where folks are going to be voting in what district and who their candidates are, do you think a lot of people are confused?
I don't think as many people are confused as some incumbent legislators would like to have us believe. I think that's a myth that was perpetrated by the legislature simply because of the unpopularity of the Cogswell plan. 2 years ago, you could go up to any Idahoan and you could ask him which district he lived in. Chances that he would be able to tell you would be pretty slim. Today, you can at least ask him which county he lives in most of Idaho. That tells you which legislative district he is in. I don't see how that has increased the confusion at all. The Flotarial district, of course, is another matter. That has added some confusion. That will take some getting used to the first time through.
Randy Staples in Pocatello, how about this confusion issue?
I think there'll be a great deal of confusion. I don't think most people have known historically who their single representative, or their single senator rather, and 2 representatives are. Now we're talking about a situation where a lot of people are going to be asked to try to figure out who their 3 or 4 senators are, and their 9 representatives are going to be. I don't see how people are going to be able to keep track of it, especially on the ballot. On the ballot, we're going to have a situation here in Bannock County and Canyon County and a number of other places where people are going to have to choose among 24 candidates. Only political professionals, only reporters, other political junkies are going to be able to keep track of that.
Jim Fisher says the county boundaries will help, though.
Well, I think they'll help a little bit, but not by much. I think
Okay.
the numbers of people are just too great.
Jane, 1 vote for confusion and 1 vote against confusion.
Well, I'd have to, in a sense, agree with both of them, and I think it depends on where you come from. Randy over in Bannock County is quite correct. They've got 4 full slates. In Canyon County, same thing. In Bonneville County, same thing. On the other hand, you take a look at, like the place I used in my example, South Post Falls up near Coeur d'Alene. Those folks must have been terribly confused 2 years ago to find out where they'd been put, and now they're where they logically should be in Kootenai County. I think had some of the counties been districted the way Ada County was, Canyon could have been, Twin Falls could have been, Kootenai could have been.
Now, Ada
Then
County
you'd
was
have
the only county that was
subdivided
into
into
districts within the county.
Yeah, so people in Ada County will vote for 1 local slate and then that Flotarial, that all of Ada County district. It's not as bad as it is in the other counties.
What about the Flotarials now? Would that contribute to the confusion?
Oh, I think it certainly contribute to the confusion for a while. I think that the one thing that should be pointed out is that in Judge Cogswell's defense, he was very clear in his order that he wanted the 1984 election to go ahead, and this was back in August of '83 when he wrote this, go ahead with no more discussion of what the plan was going to be. He said that people would need time to get used to it.
Right.
They've had very little because the legislature kept trying to change it. Give it 2 elections, and I'm not sure people won't understand the Flotarials as well as they understand anything else.
Well, for most incumbent legislators, the Flotarials were their real problem, right?
Yeah, partly, I think, in large case because of the extra bodies. And that really is a serious problem. To me, that's particularly in the House, going to be one of the most difficult things.
Can you make arguments in favor of them?
I think there's one you can make. It's the one that Bill Heller makes, for example, or Pat Costello, and that is that there are certain entities, junior colleges, for example, judicial districts, regional planning units, that cover essentially those same Flotarial district areas and have never had one set of legislators representing that whole area. They've had all sorts of delegations within them. And it may give some form of representation that they haven't had to some of those entities.
How do you feel about the Flotarials, Jim? And what effect do you think they'll have?
Going back to the point about the number of people, while it's true we've heard a number of complaints about the fact that there will be more legislators next year, you don't hear nearly as much complaining about that as you do anytime somebody suggests having fewer legislators, especially within the legislature itself. Gene and I both watched a few valiant attempts to institute a 31 district plan this year, and that was discarded out of hand because it would mean fewer people in the legislature. It would mean fewer of those incumbents would be coming back automatically. As far as the Flotarial goes, it's a necessity if you're going to maintain those county lines. Whether, you know, the wisdom of keeping that in the Constitution is another matter, but as long as we are going to observe the county lines, it's just a necessary fact of life.
Randy Staples, what about the effect of the Flotarial districts, just in terms of the raw politics of it?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I don't think the Flotarials are necessary. You can have various district boundaries, and it can be done in several ways without expanding the population deviation a great deal beyond what's in 14B right now. As far as the political effects of it are, I think that they'll simply extend the political trends in different parts of the state as they already exist. The Southwest Idaho Floterial and the Ada County Floterial will tend Republican, for instance. Those in northern Idaho will tend Democratic. But then that's just an extension of the political trends in those areas already.
Will they contribute in some way to the urbanization of the legislature with more representatives coming from more populous areas like Pocatello or Boise?
Well, I'm not at all convinced that 14B is going to contribute to the urbanization of the legislature. I can cite one specific example here in this area where it certainly will not. We have some legislators in Pocatello who have opposed subordination of the Swan Falls Dam water rights. Those legislators have been able to base their voting strength within Pocatello, which takes a similar point of view. Now they're going to have to run out in urban areas all across the county, across our county line into Power County, where the population is very much on the other side of the issue. I think it could contribute in certain areas to a ruralization of the legislature. Now that's not a majority example, but I think that the end effects will balance out.
But what about the long-term trend, Randy? Don't you think in the long term that that's just inevitable?
The long term is going to happen in any event, no matter how the districts are organized. The long-term urbanization of the legislature is going to happen as the state becomes more urban. Certainly it has been over time and it'll continue to be. That's going to happen no matter what you do by way of organizing the districts.
Jean?
I think that's true in a sense, but I still would say that in 1990, if we stay with 14B, we'll have a more urban legislature in 1990 than we would have had under the old plan. And I agree that in certain instances, depending on candidates and depending on issues, you could get even an opposite effect. But I think overall, you're particularly going to see it as incumbents retire or leave for whatever reason.
I'd like to make one other point on that, though. And that is that it's very difficult, as Jim Risch pointed out, I think it's very difficult to tell an urban legislator from a rural legislator. My perfect example in this area is Senator Burt Marley. He is an ISU professor. Most of his voting electoral strength comes from the city of Pocatello. He strongly represents Pocatello interests, but he is also a farmer who lives down in McCammon, 20 miles south of town. He could be considered either a rural or urban legislator equally well. And I can think of lots of examples of similar cases of people now in the legislature and people who are running for it.
On the question, Jim Fisher, of who wins and who loses party-wise, do you see Democrats benefiting, Republicans benefiting, or how does it shake out?
I think it'll shake out about the same as it is right now. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Go ahead, Randy.
That's okay. He was willing to stick his neck out further than I was. I really can't tell. Looking at the area of the state that I'm most familiar with, I think it's going to be pretty close to the balance that it has been in the past.
Gene, over time, some are predicting that it'll move one way or the other. Do you see that?
I think, first of all, that for the short term, it probably will stay pretty much the same. You know, the only thing that does make me wonder if in the long term it may change is those statistics we saw about statewide voting patterns and how many seats they produced.
With Republicans getting 52% of the vote and getting 68% of the seats.
And that not having been the case 20 years ago.
Right.
Part of that may be population shifts. There can be a lot of other reasons for that too.
Just on a sort of a footnote to this, I'm wondering if so much of the political concern about this has been because it's been so difficult for either party to really put a finger on it and say this is going to help us or hurt us. And there's been so much confusion about that. Am I right about that?
Oh, I think so, absolutely. I think both, members of both parties have been known to say both things. This will hurt us and this will help us. And they both now claim that a plan that most of them fought incredibly hard is going to be to their benefit.
Let me ask about some of the specific races that will be decided tomorrow that have been made, that have either happened because of reapportionment or have been made more interesting because of it. Major race in southwestern Idaho between two incumbents. You mentioned it in your piece, Deckard and Winchester.
The only head-to-head in the primary in the entire state. And again, because those additional seats were created, there were fewer head-to-head than you would have expected otherwise, given the changes in the district. Yeah, essentially you've got someone from Eagle, who is used to representing that area and some of the city of Boise.
Which is largely a bedroom community.
Largely a bedroom community, yeah. And someone from Kuna, used to representing both the Kuna area and the Meridian area, which tend to be more rural and not so much bedroom communities. And as I pointed out in the piece, one of the leading moderates and one of the leading conservatives.
As Winchester says, it's a real choice there. The voters
choice.
really have a choice. Randy, are there races interesting in southeastern Idaho that have been created or made interesting because of this situation?
Well, there are a few. Probably the most interesting race in this end of the state is our floterial Senate race between Rusty Barlow, who's a former Republican state representative, and Dwight Horsch, who is currently a Democratic state representative. Both of them live a little bit outside of Pocatello. Both of them have partly urban, partly rural voting bases. It should be a fascinating race because they're both very strong candidates.
Yeah, we'll have to wait until November to see how that one turns out. Jim Fisher, there are a couple in far northern Idaho, an incumbent Bill Moore, who has never run in Coeur d'Alene, is having to run in Coeur d'Alene against a moderate Republican, and Moore is one of the more conservative members of the Senate.
That's right. Moore didn't help himself any, I don't think, during the recent legislative session either, when he carried a bill that probably would have, in its original form anyway, probably would have stopped all annexations by cities within the state of Idaho. And the bill resulted directly from a dispute in the Coeur d'Alene area. I would think that that is going to cost him a few votes in Coeur d'Alene.
And the other interesting race in northern Idaho is in the new district that includes Benewah and Shoshone counties, where Dorothy McCann, who's the incumbent Democrat, is running against a former member, Emory Hedlund. And as I understand it, neither has run in the other's home county before.
No, that's an interesting race. And Emory Hedlund, by the way, is it could be seen as a victim of the last reapportionment plan, which was drawn by the legislature, in which he basically had to run in that district that Gene showed on the map that ran all the way from St. Mary's down close to Lewiston. Excuse me, in the district right next to it. Hedlund is well known in Benewah County. McCann is well known in Shoshone County. How well either one of them is known in the other is, well, I guess we'll find out tomorrow night.
And the population's in Shoshone, is it not?
Heavier population base there, that's correct. From what I can tell about campaigning, neither one of them has been campaigning very, very vigorously in this race.
Let me just quickly, we have just a minute left, to get a quick assessment from each of you, beginning with you, Jim, about one thing the legislature did do in the area of reapportionment was place a constitutional amendment on the ballot this fall to eliminate this requirement that we not cross county lines. You think the voters will go for that?
I don't know. Constitutional amendments, at least judging from the last election, do pretty well here in Idaho. I think that a lot of people might be willing to do that because they know that this was a mess. They just hear that this reapportionment was a mess. On the other hand, there are people who think, why should we make it easier for the legislature to go back to their old way of doing things?
Quick word on that, Randy. A good idea to eliminate that county boundary requirement?
Well, I think it's a good idea. I tend to agree with the first part of what Jim was saying. I think that most people are going to respond to the idea of going along with the constitutional amendment and won't really stop to think about the full implications of it.
Well, we've got to go, I'm afraid. Randy Staples in Pocatello, we thank you for joining us tonight. Jim Fisher in Moscow, thank you, Jim. Gene McNeil, thank you. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back here tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.